Well, good evening, church family. I feel like it's late evening at the time that I'm recording, but it's usually morning or early afternoon when I record. So maybe my slightly slower brain processing power right now matches where most of us are on Wednesday evening in the middle of a work week after a couple of long days of work. Um, Maybe that will slow my mind and my mouth down enough that this is a little bit easier to follow than it sometimes can be. We are continuing on in our study of the Gospel of Mark, and I feel like I need to pause for a second. There is actually a significant distance between this candle and that curtain. It's not on fire, uh, just to be clear. Um, I didn't actually realize how it looked that way until I started recording. So yeah, that's cool there. Um, we're continuing on our study of the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 14, and one of the things that I have continued to remind you of is how important it to read this book in its first context. And I think reading, our New Testament letters and writings in their original context or with some understanding of the world to which they were written and the people to which they're written helps us better understand the book. And tonight's passage, like several others that we have talked about along the way, is one of those that I think really highlights how meaningful it can be when we reach back and understand why this story means something to the people to whom it is first written. So, Kinsler, stop. One of the downsides of recording at home at a time when most other distractions have gone to bed is that there is still the dog. And he's now coming around the corner acting like he's very innocent, which tells me that I probably need to go worry about what he's done to the kitchen while I was not in there. Sorry. So last week we took a look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and Matthew, as I've said before, does not try to do chronology. He's not trying to tell you the story in perfect order. He's less interested in history than he is theology, and he's very concerned with helping his readers understand Jesus as a continuation of what God has always done. From Matthew, finding ways to highlight the similarities between what God does in Christ and what God has been doing along the way is paramount. Matthew's audience is predominantly Jewish. Towards the end of the first century, they're being kicked out of synagogues and beginning to wonder where their home is going to be if there's no longer a home for them with their people. When you cease to find welcome among family and in synagogue, the places that are familiar and comfortable and normal, then you have to ask some hard questions about where we belong and whether or not we are on the right path. And so Matthew is trying to encourage them that they're on the right path and highlight stories from Jesus' ministry that show that sort of conflict and rejection is par for the course. But that doesn't say that it's not still God working, because throughout Israel's history, there are moments of conflict and trial, but God is still in the middle of it all. And so last week with the feeding of the 5,000, we have this interesting stretch where Matthew intentionally links three stories together. And we've talked about the three of them separately because it would be really hard to cover them all together in a reasonable amount of time. But the death of John the Baptist, Matthew chapter 14, the rejection of Nazareth and the death of John the Baptist, the feeding of the 5,000, and then the one that we're looking at tonight. Matthew links those stories together on purpose, where he uses phrases like immediately or when Jesus heard that, where you are supposed to make sure to read these stories together. Sometimes you get non sequiturs. Then the scribes and the Pharisees came to Jesus, or one time, or sometime, or something along those lines. But when Matthew links stories on purpose, then it's important that we pay attention to that. So in Matthew 14, we have the death of John the Baptist, then we have the feeding of the 5,000, and then we have Jesus walking on water. And if you watched last week's video, I show some of the similarities between Jesus and Moses, and how this wilderness moment with the feeding of the 5,000 points to a new Exodus, including like the death of the firstborn in Egypt and the death of the one born first, John the Baptist, and how those move. Tonight's story kind of puts a bow on top of that. And I think it is once again Matthew pointing back to Jesus' ministry and trying to help the people understand Jesus as Moses, but more. And with Moses being like the central hero in the Old Testament and in first century Judaism, I even still through this day is this incredibly formative and important figure. It makes perfect sense that Matthew would reach back to him and say Jesus is like Moses, but greater. Because that's the type of encouragement and the type of message that Matthew's Jewish audience would receive and would understand. So chapter 14, starting in verse 22, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. They've had the baskets of leftovers. It's their manna in the desert moment. They are in the wilderness. It's a word used intentionally several times throughout the story to give us that image. Verse 22 says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat, go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When he got into the boat, the wind ceased, and all those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So, we continue this wilderness Exodus story. If you remember the story of the Exodus, and if you don't, just some quick details, and then go read like the entire book of Exodus. The people are in Egypt in captivity. There are the plagues, the death of the firstborn being the last, and then they leave, with Moses leading them out. There's some conflict that involves a body of water that God parts, and they're able to traverse the water. They come to the other side, to the wilderness, and they begin to become a community. There's some challenges along the way where they're hungry and they require feeding because there's not enough food, or there's not enough water, so then God provides water in some miraculous fashion from a rock. And then they come to Mount Sinai, where Moses ascends by himself. A couple of people come as helpers, but then make their way up and down and back and forth, and it depends on which part of the story you read. You get another telling of that account in Deuteronomy, Numbers. This sounds bad, but those books run together after a while. And while Moses is on the mountain alone, where there is a regular experience of thunder and lightning, and um, the ground is shaking because the presence of God is on this mountain, the people become terrified. And in their fear, they turn to something else. They create a golden calf and they worship it. And God tells Moses, hey, they're off track down there. You may want to go correct them. And it becomes this thing where like the calf gets melted down, and then the remains of the idol are dumped into the water and the people have to drink it. There's a lot of layers to that story. But if you have ears to hear, then you've probably caught some of the similarities between the long story of the Exodus and the few verses of chapter 14 that we've looked at, where now you've got this moment where we've had these other elements of the Exodus story, and Matthew now includes this one where Jesus walks on water. God doesn't have to part the water and create dry ground. Jesus is able simply to walk on the water. Remember, Moses, but better, more. Um, and so Jesus has been on the mountain praying by himself. The people that he left behind, the disciples, are in trouble, and they're beginning to become afraid because they're in the midst of the storm. And in the middle of the night, while they're just being absolutely battered by the wind and the water, which has turned against them and is preventing them from getting where they need to go, Jesus comes walking across the water to them. And again, Peter gets a really bad rap for being the guy who always has his foot in his mouth. But Peter's also the guy who steps out of the boat. So kudos to him on that one, and gets this experience where, at least for a moment, he's with Jesus on the water before he becomes distracted. And in his distraction and in his concern about what might happen to him, he begins to sink. And the text says that Jesus' response to Peter's sinking is immediate. I have no idea what this looked like on the surface of the Sea of Galilee, but I imagine that if Peter begins to drop in the water, Jesus' reflexes have to be pretty quick, do some catching, and Jesus is there. Jesus is on it, catches Peter, and then they walk back to the boat, which just seems weird. That or Jesus picks him up and carries him across the Galilean threshold to the boat. But either way, Peter is rescued there on the water by Jesus, who I'm kind of bummed that Jesus chides him for his moment of doubt there, because there were 11 guys who didn't get out of the boat that maybe deserve a little more of that chiding. But none of that is the point. What I love about Matthew is when you pay attention to how he writes, you begin to understand what he's highlighting and what messages are most important for him to communicate to his audience. So you have all of these stories from Jesus' life that he weaves together in a way to remind you that Jesus is doing the work of God like Moses, but more so. And all of this story builds to this one moment where they all get back in the boat and the storm ceases, and everyone who's in the boat responds to what they've just witnessed by worshiping Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of Matthew opens with this pronouncement that Jesus is going to be born and he's going to be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And here in chapter 14, at like the halfway point in Matthew's gospel, we've had all of these moments, like through this point to this point in Matthew, we've had all of these moments where people get snapshots and glimpses and some understanding, and they develop some faith. They hear some teaching, and they argue a little bit and learn a little bit. And there are some who are called who follow, and there are some who are called that aren't, that don't, and like all of that is read by Matthew's community, I think, as their journey, because they've struggled and they've wondered, and there now have come moments of doubt, and they've been accepted and then they've been rejected, and like they're experiencing this new community, but they really want to be a part of the old community that they've always been a part of, and suddenly that no longer seems like it's where they belong. And here in the middle of the book, Matthew points to Jesus and their experience and their tradition and the new thing that they're feeling, and says, Exodus. God is moving. God is with us. Are you going to follow? That's really what these stories lead to. It shouldn't be surprising if you've come to understand that Matthew is putting these stories together in a way to make points, not to, give a perfect historic rendition. It shouldn't be surprising that after this worshiping of Jesus as the presence of God, there's going to be an argument in the next big section of story over the traditions of the elders, what's old and what's new. And so we've hit that point in the book where Matthew is encouraging his first readers to understand that in Jesus, they have God with them. They have the presence of God. That God has come to earth and is living like among them. And that they can be confident and trust. They can weather the storms and step out of the boat. And in their moments of doubt, Jesus rescues them. This is not the Sinai experience where the people doubt and there's no immediate rescue, right? Like Moses is still on the mountain. They have time to build a golden calf, which probably took a minute. In this case, Moses, but better, the rescue comes immediately because God is with us. Weird that we have to work through 14 chapters of Matthew to get to an actual Christmas message, and it's nowhere near the birth, but there you go. When you hear Emmanuel, usually only this time of year, when you share the phrase God with us, this is really what that is first used to point to. And it's encouragement to weather the storms. It's a promise that God is in the midst of it all. And one of the things that sticks out to me from the story is that the wind doesn't cease like as Jesus walks on the water, right? The winds don't cease until after all of this has happened. Like even as Peter steps out of the boat, there's still wind and there's still rain. And for Matthew's audience, the recognition that Jesus is the presence of God, that in Jesus we have God with us, doesn't mean that all of the storms that they're experiencing are going to go away. There's no promise like that. Instead, the promise is that in the midst of the storm, when the wind is against you, when the water is choppy and the waves are big, God is with you. And in those moments, when all you have left is a little bit of faith, that's still enough to do something with Jesus, which is exactly what Peter does. Yeah, I think that's a good spot to wrap up for the evening. Hope that made sense. Oh, this is a weird setting. I've gotten kind of used to having a whiteboard to reference and write things out, but this week is just not going to provide that. This feels like what we were doing a year ago. I don't know. I got to have a candle and it smells nice, which is a pleasant change. Usually I'm smelling whiteboard and dry erase markers still, so I'll take it. I hope that you can find some encouragement from this video. I hope that the message, God with us, one that our ear is attuned to, more so this time of year, can find a home for you. We will continue on next week, picking up in chapter 15. I can cover the rest of chapter 14 by saying this. Jesus is in an area that is not strictly Jewish, and he's healing people, which means that little side note that Jesus does some work in this area is a reminder that the community that Jesus serves and the community that Jesus is building, the new Exodus community, is larger than just the Jewish community. And again, that says something for Matthew's early readers. And I think certainly should remind us of just how expansive the kingdom of God is. All right. Glad you joined us for this video whenever you've gotten time to watch it. See you next week as we continue on in the Gospel of Matthew. Bye, y'all.